Carlos Santos sat behind the wheel of his car, mentally replaying the events of his day. It had been a long one. Court hearings had dragged on and a late meeting with other federal judges. Now, all he wanted was to get home, kick off his shoes, and unwind. The quiet streets of the suburban neighborhood were almost deserted, with only the hum of his car to keep him company. As he turned a corner, he noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Confused, Carlos glanced at his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't made any sudden turns or violated any traffic rules. Despite the lack of reason, the police car behind him blared its siren, signaling him to pull over. Carlos sighed, pulling his car to the side of the road. He had had run-ins with police before, enough to know where this might be heading. But tonight, he hoped things would be different. Maybe it was just a routine check. Maybe they wouldn't escalate it this time. As a federal judge, he knew better than most how these situations could spiral, but he still held on to a glimmer of optimism. The police car stopped just behind him, and two officers, both white, got out. Carlos watched in the mirror as they approached, their faces blank but their postures tense. One officer, tall and broad-shouldered, knocked on the driver's side window with a little more force than necessary. "License and registration," the officer barked. Carlos slowly rolled down the window, careful to keep his hands visible. "Good evening, officers. May I ask what the problem is?" The tall officer ignored the question, only repeating his demand, license and registration. Carlos complied, reaching for his wallet and the car's documents. As he handed them over, the second officer, shorter and with a more aggressive demeanor, circled the car like a predator inspecting its prey. "This your car?" the shorter officer asked, eyeing Carlos suspiciously. "Yes," Carlos replied, his tone calm. He'd learned long ago not to rise to their bait. The tall officer glanced at the registration, then at Carlos. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Carlos raised an eyebrow but remained composed. "I live here." "Is there a problem, officer?" The officers exchanged glances. The taller one handed the documents to his partner without answering, while the shorter officer seemed more interested in making Carlos uncomfortable than actually running the information. The tension in the air thickened. Carlos could feel it. The way the situation was shifting from routine to something more sinister. He knew where this was heading, but he was determined to remain calm, to not give them any reason to escalate things further. "Step out of the car," the shorter officer ordered abruptly. Carlos hesitated. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" "Step out of the car." The officer's tone was laced with hostility now, his hand hovering near his holster. Carlos' heart raced, but he did as he was told, unbuckling his seatbelt and stepping out into the cool night air. Before he could say another word, the taller officer grabbed him by the arm and yanked him toward the hood of the car. "You're resisting," the officer muttered, pressing Carlos' chest against the cold metal. "I'm not resisting," Carlos protested, his voice firm but not raised. "There's no need for this." But his words were ignored. The shorter officer moved behind him, roughly pulling Carlos' arms behind his back and slapping the cold steel of handcuffs around his wrists. Carlos winced as the cuffs bit into his skin, but he remained silent. He knew anything he said could be twisted against him. Inside, though, anger simmered. He was a judge, for God's sake. He spent his days ensuring justice was served. Yet here he was, being treated like a common criminal for no reason other than the color of his skin. The officers continued to search him and his car, without explanation, without cause. Carlos kept his head down, knowing there was nothing he could say that would change their minds. They had already decided what kind of man they thought he was. And so, Carlos stood there, cuffed and humiliated, as the officers rummaged through his belongings, searching for a crime that didn't exist. The ride to the station was silent, but the tension in the air was palpable. Carlos sat in the back of the police car, his wrists still cuffed and his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He hadn't broken any laws, hadn't done anything to warrant this kind of treatment. Yet here he was, being carted off to jail as though he were some dangerous criminal. The two officers exchanged glances in the front seat but didn't speak. They had what they wanted, an excuse to exert their power. Carlos felt the frustration well up inside him, but he forced himself to breathe to stay calm. He knew how quickly things could spiral out of control. As the car pulled into the police station, the shorter officer, Officer Jennings, opened the door and yanked Carlos out roughly. "Let's go," Jennings muttered, leading him through the back entrance. Carlos' mind was in a haze, still struggling to process everything. He'd spent years in courtrooms, presiding over cases where people were treated unfairly, but being on the other side of that equation was a different kind of reality. Once inside, the officers walked him past rows of desks where other officers worked, glancing up only briefly before going back to whatever paperwork occupied their attention. Carlos caught a few curious stares, but no one said anything. They were used to seeing people in cuffs, no matter their circumstances. The officers led Carlos down a narrow hallway toward a set of holding cells. The metallic clank of the cell door as it swung open was deafening in the quiet corridor. Jennings pushed Carlos inside, locking the door behind him without a word. Carlos sat on the cold metal bench in the corner of the cell, his hands still cuffed behind his back. He stared at the dirty concrete floor, replaying the events in his mind. He could hear the other officers talking outside, their voices muffled but full of authority. Minutes passed, then hours. Carlos had tried to explain who he was, tried to tell the officers that there had been a mistake, but his words fell on deaf ears. His credentials didn't matter here. The law didn't matter here. All that mattered was that he fit the profile they had already decided on. At one point, Officer Jennings came by to check on him, though it felt more like an intimidation tactic than anything else. Jennings stood at the bars, arms crossed, staring at Carlos with a smirk. "You know, you should have just cooperated from the beginning," Jennings sneered. "Would have saved you a lot of trouble." Carlos looked up, his eyes narrowing. "I told you who I am. You have my ID, my registration. You know there's been a mistake." Jennings shrugged as if the truth were inconsequential. "People like you always think you're above the law." The word stung, but Carlos bit his tongue. He knew better than to argue. This wasn't the place for logic or reason. It wasn't a courtroom where facts could be presented, where justice could be served. Here, the officers held all the power, and they were using it to their fullest advantage. Hours dragged on, and eventually Officer Daniels, the taller, quieter one, approached the cell. He seemed a bit more hesitant than his partner, but still carried that same air of indifference. "We're running your information," Daniels said flatly, as if the situation were routine. "Sit tight." Carlos shook his head, barely able to contain his frustration. "I've told you who I am multiple times. Check my ID. Check my credentials. I am a federal judge, for God's sake." Daniels gave him a brief glance before turning away, muttering something under his breath. The door to the hallway creaked open and shut, leaving Carlos alone again in the cold, empty cell. As the hours wore on, exhaustion crept in. Carlos leaned back against the wall, trying to stay calm, but the weight of the situation bore down on him. He'd dealt with injustice before, but never so personally, never so viscerally. This was a stark reminder of the reality faced by so many others who didn't have the privilege of his position. But no matter his status, here in this cell, all that mattered was the color of his skin. Hours later, Carlos sat in the same position, his back pressed against the cold concrete wall, his wrists still sore from the handcuffs. The sounds of the station echoed faintly from the hallway. Phones ringing, papers shuffling, officers chatting casually as if this were just another night on the job. For them, It probably was. Carlos tried to steady his breathing. He knew he had to stay calm, but the longer he sat in that cell, the more difficult it became. His mind raced with thoughts about how this could play out, the implications if this incident became public. He wasn't just any man off the street. He was a federal judge, someone who had dedicated his life to the justice system. But tonight, it seemed like that meant nothing. Outside the cell, Officer Daniel sat at his desk, running Carlos' information through the system for what felt like the 10th time. He wasn't entirely sure why, but something about this arrest didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the way Carlos had handled himself, not like the usual suspects they brought in. Or maybe it was the ID in his hands that he'd been looking at for the past few minutes. Daniels glanced at the photo again. Carlos Santos. The name sounded familiar. He couldn't quite place it, but there was something there. He flipped through the registration papers again, noticing the details that should have raised red flags much sooner. A prestigious address, a list of certifications that went well beyond anything they normally saw. But none of that had mattered in the moment of the arrest. All they'd seen was a black man in a nice car, and that had been enough. Jennings, meanwhile, lounged at his own desk, his feet propped up as he scrolled through his phone. He hadn't shown much interest in the arrest beyond the initial rush of power, and now that Carlos was in the system, he didn't seem to care at all. "What are you still looking at that for?" Jennings asked lazily, noticing Daniel still holding the ID. Daniel shrugged, not looking up. "Something's off about this guy." Jennings scoffed. "Yeah. What's off is he thought he could talk his way out of it. Just another guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him." But Daniels wasn't so sure. He turned back to his computer, entering Carlos' full name into a different database, one that was reserved for more thorough background checks. A few moments passed, and then something popped up on the screen that made Daniels pause. Federal Judge. The words blinked at him from the screen, as if mocking the entire situation. Carlos Santos was not just anyone. He was a sitting federal judge, someone with real power, someone with connections that could make their lives a living hell if this got out. Daniel sat back in his chair, suddenly feeling the weight of the mistake they had made. He glanced over at Jennings, who was still on his phone, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. For a moment, Daniels considered telling him, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the fact that Jennings wouldn't care, or maybe it was that Daniels knew it was too late to fix things now. The damage had been done. Still, Daniels wasn't ready to face the consequences just yet. He didn't say a word about what he had found. Instead, he closed the file and stood up, heading for the hallway that led to the holding cells. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. Should he let Carlos go? Should he tell his superior? Should he warn Jennings? As he approached the cell, Daniels hesitated, his hand resting on the handle of the door. Through the bars, he could see Carlos sitting there, still calm, still composed despite everything. For a brief moment, Daniels considered just opening the door and letting him walk out, hoping to avoid the inevitable fallout. But fear held him back. Carlos looked up as Daniels entered, sensing that something had changed. There was a shift in the officer's demeanor, something more cautious now. Daniels stood in front of the cell for a moment, saying nothing, just looking at the man they had wrongly arrested. "I ran your information," Daniels finally said, his voice low. "I know who you are." Carlos didn't respond, just watched him carefully, waiting for what came next. He knew this was a turning point, the moment where things could either get better or worse. Daniels fidgeted, unsure of how to proceed. "Why didn't you say something?" he asked, though it was a weak question. He knew Carlos had tried to tell them the truth from the beginning. "I did," Carlos replied evenly. "You just didn't listen." Daniels flinched slightly at the truth of that statement. He opened his mouth to say something else, but the words didn't come. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked out of the room, leaving Carlos alone in the cell once more. Officer Daniels walked back to his desk, his mind swirling with the implications of what he had just discovered. A federal judge. How could they have missed that? And now, the consequences of their actions were starting to settle in, weighing heavier by the second. Jennings still sat at his desk, completely unaware of the ticking time bomb they were sitting on. Daniel's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he debated whether to make a move. He could try to keep it quiet, pretend it was just another routine arrest, but the system didn't work like that. Once the judge's name was fully processed, it would be flagged. It wouldn't take long before someone higher up realized what had happened, and when they did, the blowback would be immense. Jennings glanced over, noticing the tension in Daniel's expression. "What's with you, man? You've been acting weird ever since we brought that guy in." Daniels didn't answer immediately. He could feel the knot in his stomach tighten. "We screwed up," he finally muttered, his voice barely audible. Jennings raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. "What are you talking about?" "He's a judge, a federal judge," Daniels said, staring at the screen as if saying it out loud made it worse. "We arrested a federal judge for no reason." Jennings blinked, and for the first time all night, his cocky demeanor faltered. "Wait, what? How? You're serious?" Daniels nodded. "His name's Carlos Santos. I ran his information. He's been a judge for years." Jennings stared at him, the realization slowly sinking in. His face hardened, but there was a flicker of panic in his eyes. "Shit." For a moment, the two officers sat in silence, the gravity of their mistake settling between them like a thick fog. Jennings, who had been so sure of himself during the arrest, now looked pale. "What the hell are we supposed to do?" he muttered, more to himself than to Daniels. Daniels ran a hand through his hair, trying to think. "We need to tell the captain before this blows up. We can't just sweep this under the rug." Jennings stood up, pacing behind his desk, clearly unnerved by the turn of events. "If this gets out, we're screwed. The media will have a field day. You know how this looks, right? Two white cops arresting a black federal judge for no reason. It's a nightmare." Daniels couldn't argue with that. The optics were bad, worse than bad. And the fact that Carlos had been calm throughout the whole ordeal only made it worse. He hadn't resisted, hadn't done anything to justify their actions. The more Daniels thought about it, the more he realized how deep in trouble they really were. "I'll talk to the captain," Daniels said, standing up. "We have to get ahead of this before it blows up. Maybe if we explain ourselves, we can, I don't know, make it right somehow." Jennings scoffed. "Yeah, good luck with that." As Daniels walked away, heading toward the captain's office, his heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Meanwhile, back in the holding cell, Carlos remained calm, though inside, he could feel the weight of the injustice bearing down on him. He'd been through a lot in his life, but this was different. It was personal. He had always known the system had its flaws, had seen it from the other side of the bench, but experiencing it firsthand was a different kind of pain. He wondered what was happening on the other side of the bars. Had they realized their mistake yet? Were they trying to figure out how to handle it, or were they still caught up in their own arrogance? Either way, Carlos knew that things were about to change. There was no way they could keep this under wraps for long. The sound of footsteps approaching the cell caught Carlos' attention. It was Officer Daniels again, but this time his expression was different. He looked nervous, almost apologetic, as if he knew the weight of the mistake they had made. Daniels stopped in front of the bars, looking down for a moment before meeting Carlos' gaze. "The captain's going to see you," he said quietly. Carlos stood, his face calm, but his eyes sharp. "It's about time." Daniels nodded, unlocking the cell door. "I'm sorry," he muttered as Carlos stepped out, though the apology felt hollow. Sorry wasn't going to fix this. Sorry wasn't going to change what had happened. But Carlos remained silent, choosing to save his words for the captain. As they walked down the hallway, the other officers glanced over but said nothing, their eyes following Carlos as he passed. The tension was thick, and Carlos could feel it in every step. He was no longer just another man in custody. He was a judge, and the officers around him were starting to realize just how badly they had messed up. Carlos was led down a long corridor, his footsteps echoing softly as he followed Officer Daniels. The tension in the air was almost suffocating, and Carlos could sense that Daniels was nervous, unsure of how the captain would react or what would come next. But Carlos remained composed. He had been in intense situations before, and if there was one thing he knew, it was how to maintain control. When they reached the captain's office, Daniels paused outside the door, hesitating for a moment before knocking. The muffled voice of Captain Mitchell, a gruff older man who commanded the respect of his precinct, answered from within. "Come in." Daniels opened the door, motioning for Carlos to step inside. The captain sat behind a large, cluttered desk, his brow furrowed as he glanced up from a file. His eyes flicked over Carlos, and for a split second, there was a flash of recognition. Carlos could tell immediately that the captain knew who he was, or at least had been briefed on his identity. "Judge Santos," Captain Mitchell said, his voice a mix of strained authority and underlying regret. "Please have a seat." Carlos sat down across from him, his posture steady and his gaze unwavering. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment where he would finally get answers, or at the very least, an acknowledgement of the egregious mistake that had been made. The captain sighed, leaning back in his chair, his hands folded on the desk in front of him. "I've been informed about what happened tonight, and I'll start by saying that this is not how we conduct business here at this precinct." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding?" The word felt like an insult. A misunderstanding was something small, something innocent. This was anything but. Captain Mitchell cleared his throat. "The officers who arrested you didn't realize who you were at the time. They didn't need to know who I was," Carlos interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "That's the whole point, isn't it? I shouldn't have to be a federal judge to be treated with respect and dignity." The captain shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly not used to being challenged in his own office. "You're right," he admitted after a moment. "There's no excuse for what happened, and I assure you, we'll be conducting a full investigation into the matter." Carlos sat back slightly, watching the captain carefully. He knew the language of damage control when he heard it, and right now, that's all this was, an attempt to smooth things over, to avoid a scandal. "What happens next?" Carlos asked, his voice steady. "Am I free to go, or are you planning to detain me further?" Captain Mitchell shook his head quickly. "You're free to go, of course. This entire incident was a mistake, and we'll be handling it internally. The officers involved will be disciplined." Carlos nodded but didn't say anything. He knew how these things worked. Discipline often meant a slap on the wrist, a way for the department to show that they had done something without actually addressing the root of the problem. The captain stood, signaling that the meeting was over. "I deeply regret what happened tonight, Judge Santos. I hope you'll accept our apologies." Carlos stood as well, meeting the captain's gaze with a measured intensity. "What I accept or don't accept is irrelevant. What matters is that this doesn't happen again to anyone." The captain gave a curt nod, clearly eager to end the conversation. "Understood." With that, Carlos turned and walked out of the office, his mind already racing with what to do next. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As Carlos made his way through the station, he passed Officer Jennings, who was standing by the front desk, his face pale and his expression hard. Their eyes met briefly, but neither man said a word. Jennings looked away first, clearly uncomfortable under Carlos' unwavering gaze. Daniels, who had been lingering nearby, hurried to catch up with Carlos as he exited the station. "Judge Santos," he called, sounding a little breathless. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I should have handled it differently." Carlos stopped, turning to face him. There was something genuine in Daniel's expression, something that made Carlos pause for a moment. He could see the conflict in the young officer's eyes, the realization that they had made a terrible mistake. "Apologies are easy, Officer Daniels," Carlos said quietly. "What matters is what you do next." Daniels nodded slowly, clearly taking the words to heart. "I understand." Without another word, Carlos turned and stepped out into the night. The cool air hit his face, and for a moment he stood still, letting the reality of what had happened sink in. He had been through an ordeal that no one, no matter their status or background, should have to endure. But now, it was time to take action. There were people who needed to know what had happened. There was a system that needed to change. Carlos stepped out of the precinct and into the cool night air, taking a moment to breathe deeply. He could still feel the tension of the station lingering on his shoulders, but he knew he couldn't let it weigh him down. The world outside was waiting, and it was time to turn his experience into action. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for: Maria Torres. She was a well-respected journalist, known for her investigative work on police misconduct and racial injustice. Carlos knew she would take the story seriously. She had a knack for exposing the truth, no matter how ugly it was. As the phone rang, Carlos could feel a mixture of apprehension and determination. He needed to share what had happened, not just for himself, but for others who might not have the same platform or privilege. Maria answered after a few rings, her voice bright and welcoming. "Carlos, it's good to hear from you. What's going on?" "Maria, I need to talk to you now. It's urgent." "Sure, is everything okay?" she asked, her tone shifting to concern. "Not really. I was arrested tonight. Wrongfully." There was a pause on the other end. "What? Are you serious?" Carlos took a deep breath. "Yeah, I was stopped by the police, and they didn't listen to me when I told them who I was. I need to tell you the whole story." "I'm on my way," Maria replied without hesitation. "Where do you want to meet?" Carlos suggested a nearby cafe that was open late. It was a quiet place, perfect for discussing something as sensitive as what he had just experienced. As he walked to the cafe, he mentally rehearsed the details of the night: how he had been treated, how his identity had been disregarded, and how he felt now, standing on the other side of such a harrowing experience. When he arrived at the cafe, he found a booth in the corner, ordered a coffee, and waited. It wasn't long before Maria arrived, her expression serious yet empathetic as she took a seat across from him. "All right, Carlos. What happened?" As he recounted the events of the night, the stop, the arrest, and the realization that he was a federal judge, Maria listened intently, her pen moving quickly across the pages of her notepad. She didn't interrupt, letting him speak freely about his feelings of anger and betrayal. When he finished, she looked up, her eyes filled with understanding. "This is huge, Carlos. It's not just about you. This speaks to a larger issue of systemic racism and police misconduct. You have a voice, and people need to hear this." Carlos nodded, feeling a sense of validation. "I know it's important, but I also worry about the backlash. I'm in a position where I could make waves, but I'm also aware of the consequences that might follow." Maria leaned in closer, her voice firm. "Change doesn't happen in silence. You have the power to make a difference. If we don't speak up, nothing will change." They spent the next hour discussing how to approach the story, weighing the risks and the potential impact. Carlos felt invigorated by the conversation, realizing that sharing his truth could inspire others who had faced similar injustices. By the time they finished, he had decided to go public with his story. It was time to shed light on the reality of racial profiling and police brutality. As they wrapped up, Maria pulled out her phone and started scheduling interviews and press releases. "We'll get this out there, Carlos. You won't be alone in this." Carlos felt a mix of fear and excitement. He knew that by stepping into the spotlight, he was also stepping into a storm, but he was ready to face whatever came next. "Thank you, Maria. I appreciate your support. Just remember, this is about more than just you. It's about justice for everyone who has suffered at the hands of the police. We'll make sure your voice is heard." With a renewed sense of purpose, Carlos left the cafe, knowing he was about to enter a battle much larger than himself. He had a platform now, and he intended to use it. In the days that followed, Carlos found himself thrust into a whirlwind of media attention. Maria had worked quickly, and soon his story was all over the news. Interviews, articles, and social media posts began to circulate, each detailing the wrongful arrest of a federal judge by 2 police officers who had acted without justification. Carlos was both relieved and overwhelmed. Every morning, he woke to see his face on the front pages of newspapers and his name trending on social media. He was getting calls from local and national outlets, eager to hear his side of the story. But with the spotlight came scrutiny, and Carlos was acutely aware of how quickly public opinion could shift. Despite the attention, he remained focused. He spent hours talking with Maria, crafting his narrative to ensure it conveyed the truth of his experience, while shedding light on the broader issue of police misconduct. Together, they worked tirelessly to highlight systemic racism and the urgent need for reform within the police force. One afternoon, as he was preparing for another round of interviews, Carlos received a phone call from his old friend, David, a community activist. "Carlos, I saw your story," David said, his voice filled with pride. "You're doing an amazing thing. We need to rally the community behind you." Carlos felt a surge of gratitude. "Thanks, David. I'm trying to bring attention to the issue, but it feels like such a huge battle." "It is," David acknowledged, "but we can't let fear stop us. Let's organize a march, a rally to stand against police brutality, and show solidarity with everyone who's been wronged." The idea excited Carlos. He had always believed in the power of community, and he knew that standing together would amplify their voices. "Let's do it," he replied, his resolve strengthening. Over the next week, the plans for the rally came together quickly. With David's help, they secured permits and spread the word through social media, flyers, and local community centers. The message was clear: justice for Carlos Santos and an end to police violence. As the day of the rally approached, Carlos felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. He knew that many people would show up, but he also understood that this event would attract attention from both supporters and those who opposed their message. On the day of the rally, Carlos arrived at the park where the event was set to take place. The air was electric, filled with the sounds of voices chanting for justice and the rustling of signs that read justice for Carlos and end police brutality. Carlos felt a wave of emotions wash over him: gratitude, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. As the crowd gathered, David stepped up to the microphone to address the attendees. "Today, we stand together for justice," he shouted, his voice booming. "We are here to support Carlos Santos, a man who was wrongfully arrested and treated with disrespect by the very system that is supposed to protect us." Cheers erupted from the crowd, and Carlos felt a swell of pride as he watched his community come together. He had always known the importance of solidarity, but seeing it in action was something entirely different. When it was Carlos' turn to speak, he stepped up to the microphone, his heart racing. The sight of so many faces looking back at him filled him with determination. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady. "What happened to me is not just about me. It's about all of us. Every person who is facing injustice, discrimination, and violence." He paused, allowing his words to resonate with the crowd. We cannot allow fear to silence us. We must demand change and accountability from our police officers and from the system. This isn't just my fight. It's our fight. The crowd erupted into applause, and Carlos felt a surge of hope. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance anymore. He was a catalyst for change. Together with the community, he would work to ensure that what happened to him would not happen to anyone else. As the rally continued, the atmosphere shifted from one of anger and frustration to a feeling of empowerment. People shared their own stories, their voices rising in unison, creating a chorus of resilience. Carlos knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless. In the weeks following the rally, the momentum Carlos had created didn't wane. His story continued to resonate, sparking discussions across the nation about racial profiling and police accountability. News outlets reported on the impact of the rally, and many other victims of police violence came forward to share their experiences, further amplifying the call for change. However, with the newfound attention came challenges. Carlos began receiving anonymous messages online, some supportive, others filled with threats and hate. It was a stark reminder of the backlash that often accompanies speaking out against systemic issues. Despite this, he refused to let fear dictate his actions. He knew that the path to justice was fraught with obstacles, but he also understood the importance of perseverance. One afternoon, as he was preparing for a meeting with community leaders to discuss further actions, Maria called him. "Carlos, I have some important news," she said, her tone serious. "What's going on?" he asked, a knot forming in his stomach. "The internal investigation into the officers involved in your arrest is complete. The department has decided to take action against them." Carlos felt a mix of relief and skepticism. "What kind of action?" "They've been put on administrative leave pending further review, but there's also a push for more severe consequences," Maria explained. "There's talk of termination." Carlos remained cautious. "That sounds good, but I hope this leads to real change within the department." "It will," Maria reassured him. "Your story has ignited a movement. People are demanding accountability." Inspired by the news, Carlos met with the community leaders the following day. They discussed strategies for continuing the fight for justice, including pushing for policy changes within the police department and advocating for greater transparency. They also planned to establish support networks for individuals who had experienced similar injustices, ensuring that no one would have to face their struggles alone. As the discussion concluded, David turned to Carlos. "We need to capitalize on this momentum. Let's organize a town hall meeting to discuss police reform and community safety." Carlos agreed wholeheartedly. "Yes, we need to engage with the community and ensure everyone's voice is heard." The town hall meeting was scheduled for the following month, and excitement buzzed throughout the community. Carlos prepared for it as if it were a court case, studying the issues and potential solutions. He wanted to be informed, ready to answer questions and inspire hope among the attendees. On the day of the meeting, the community center was filled to capacity. Citizens from all walks of life had gathered, eager to express their concerns and ideas. As Carlos stood at the front of the room, he felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but it was a weight he was ready to carry. He opened the meeting, discussing his experience and emphasizing the need for systemic change. "This is our chance to take action, to create a future where everyone feels safe and respected," he said, his voice steady. "Together, we can hold our police accountable and ensure that no one else faces what I did." The crowd responded with a chorus of cheers and applause, their energy infectious. People began to share their stories, their frustrations, and their visions for a better community. Carlos listened intently, taking notes and encouraging others to speak up. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that the community was ready for change. Ideas flowed freely and actionable plans began to form. By the end of the evening, they had a list of initiatives to pursue, including community-led training sessions for police officers and the creation of a civilian review board to oversee police conduct. Walking home that night, Carlos felt a sense of accomplishment wash over him. He had taken a significant step toward justice, not just for himself, but for everyone affected by police brutality. As he looked up at the stars, he realized that while the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, he was not alone. He was part of a community that had found its voice, and together, they would continue to fight for what was right. Carlos knew that this was only the beginning, but he felt more hopeful than ever. The changes they sought were within reach, and he was determined to see it through. In that moment, Carlos understood that his struggle was not merely about seeking justice for himself. It was about creating a legacy of change for future generations. And that legacy would not be defined by fear or silence, but by courage, resilience, and the unwavering belief in justice for all.